700 million years ago, the Earth disappeared. Not destroyed. Not struck by an asteroid. Not poisoned by a volcanic event. It simply vanished beneath ice. The oceans froze to depths of a kilometer or more. The equator, which today sits under permanent tropical heat, was colder than Antarctica is now. The entire surface of the planet, from pole to pole, was covered in white. If you had been orbiting the Earth at that moment, you would have seen nothing but a featureless white ball hanging in space. You would not have known it was a planet capable of producing life. You would not have known life already existed on it. This is not speculation. This is what the geological evidence tells us happened, at least twice, and possibly 3 or 4 times, during the Neoproterozoic era. Scientists call it Snowball Earth, and it is one of the most extreme environmental events in the history of the planet. The entire global ocean froze. The global average temperature dropped to approximately -50 degrees Celsius. Any organism that could not find a warm refuge, near a volcanic hot spring or beneath the ice at a geothermal vent, died. And yet something survived. And what came after the ice melted is one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of life. Within 100 million years of the last Snowball Earth event, the oceans were filled with complex multicellular animals for the first time in the history of the planet. The Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of virtually every major animal body plan in the fossil record, followed the last Snowball Earth event like a spring following the longest winter imaginable. Subscribe now if you want to be here for the next journey. Every week a new documentary, always calm, always in the dark, always deeper than the last. The Snowball Earth hypothesis was not always taken seriously. When geologist Brian Harland first proposed in the 1960s that evidence of glaciation existed at tropical latitudes in Precambrian rocks, the suggestion was met with skepticism. Glacial deposits at the equator seemed to violate everything geologists believed about how climate worked. The standard explanation was that the rocks had been deposited at high latitudes and had subsequently moved to their current position through continental drift. But as more evidence accumulated, and as paleomagnetic data began to constrain the position of the continents at the time of deposition with increasing precision, the tropical glaciation hypothesis became harder to dismiss. By the 1990s, geologist Paul Hoffman had assembled the evidence into a coherent global picture that demanded a global explanation, and the Snowball Earth hypothesis was born as a serious scientific proposal. The name was coined not by Hoffman but by his colleague Joe Kirschvink, who had been thinking about the problem since the 1980s and who recognized that the positive feedback mechanisms of ice and reflectivity, once triggered, could drive a runaway glaciation that would not stop until the entire planet was frozen. That insight, combining climate physics with geological evidence, was the conceptual key that unlocked the problem. A planet covered in white ice reflects more than 90% of incoming solar radiation back into space. A planet covered in dark ocean or dark land absorbs that energy. The transition from one state to the other, once it begins, accelerates itself. And once the entire planet is covered in ice, it is locked in that state until enough carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere from volcanic outgassing to overwhelm the reflectivity of the ice and trigger a catastrophic warming. The physical scale of the Snowball Earth glaciation is almost impossible to comprehend through numbers alone. The volume of ice that covered the Earth during a full snowball event was approximately 30 times the volume of ice in today's Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets combined. That ice was not merely sitting on the continents. It covered the oceans as well, extending from the poles to the equator in a continuous shell of ice that in the deeper ocean regions was thin, perhaps only a few hundred meters, but in the regions above the continental shelves and in the polar basins was several kilometers thick. The weight of that ice on the ocean floor depressed the oceanic crust, just as the modern ice sheets depress the continental crust beneath them, and when the ice melted, the ocean floor rebounded, producing a complex pattern of geological deformation that is preserved in the Neoproterozoic rock record. The geological evidence for Snowball Earth comes from multiple independent lines of investigation that have been assembled over the past 30 years into a picture that is now broadly accepted by the scientific community, though some of its details remain actively debated. The most direct evidence is the presence of glacial deposits at tropical latitudes. Glacial sediments have distinctive characteristics. They contain large boulders mixed with fine sediment, a texture called diamictite that forms when glaciers pick up and carry material of all sizes and deposit it together when they melt. They contain striated and polished rocks, the marks left when ice drags stones across bedrock. And they contain dropstones, large boulders that fall into fine-grained marine sediment when the icebergs that carry them melt, producing a characteristic disruption of the sediment layers. All of these features are found in Neoproterozoic rocks on every continent, at latitudes that paleomagnetic data indicates were tropical at the time of deposition. The paleomagnetic evidence is particularly compelling. When volcanic or sedimentary rocks form, magnetic minerals within them align with the Earth's magnetic field, preserving a record of the field direction at the time of formation. Since the direction of the magnetic field varies systematically with latitude, the magnetic record in ancient rocks can be used to reconstruct the latitude at which they formed. The paleomagnetic data from Neoproterozoic glacial deposits around the world consistently indicates formation at low latitudes, within 30 degrees of the equator, and in some cases within a few degrees of the equatorial line itself. The carbon isotope record provides a third independent line of evidence. Carbonate rocks, which form in shallow marine environments, preserve a record of the carbon isotope ratio of the ancient ocean. That ratio reflects the balance between organic carbon burial, which preferentially removes the lighter carbon isotope from the ocean, and volcanic outgassing, which adds carbon with a different isotopic composition. During normal periods of active marine biology, the ocean is enriched in the heavier carbon isotope because the biological productivity of the ocean is removing the lighter one. During the Snowball Earth intervals, when the ocean surface was frozen and marine biological productivity essentially ceased, the carbon isotope ratio of the ocean shifted dramatically toward lighter values, producing a distinctive signal in the carbonate rocks deposited during and after the glaciation. The combination of those three independent lines of evidence, glacial deposits at tropical latitudes, paleomagnetic confirmation of their low-latitude origin, and carbon isotope anomalies consistent with the collapse of marine productivity, is what gave the Snowball Earth hypothesis its scientific credibility. No alternative explanation has been proposed that accounts for all three lines of evidence simultaneously. How did the Earth freeze in the first place? The question is easier to answer than you might expect once you understand the relationship between ice, sunlight, and the feedback mechanisms that govern planetary climate. The Neoproterozoic era, which extends from approximately 1 billion years ago to 541 million years ago, was a period of significant changes in the configuration of the Earth's continents. The supercontinent Rodinia, which had assembled during the preceding billion years, was breaking apart. That breakup had two important consequences for the climate. First, the exposure of fresh rock along the rifting margins of the fragmenting continents accelerated the weathering of silicate rocks, a chemical process that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and buries it as carbonate sediments in the ocean. That removal of greenhouse gas caused a long-term cooling of the global climate. Second, the positions of the newly fragmented continents were concentrated at low latitudes, which meant that there was relatively little land at the poles, where ice sheets most easily form, and relatively more land in the tropics and subtropics, where higher weathering rates continued to draw down atmospheric carbon dioxide. The dating of the Snowball Earth events has been one of the most technically challenging aspects of the research program, because the rocks that preserve the direct evidence of glaciation are often sedimentary, and sedimentary rocks cannot be directly dated by the radioactive decay methods used to date igneous rocks. The approach that has been most successful is to identify volcanic ash layers interbedded with the glacial deposits, which can be dated using uranium lead methods in zircon crystals with high precision. Those dates have progressively constrained the timing of the Sturtian and Marinoan glaciations, but the precision is still typically plus or minus a few million years, which is sufficient to establish the broad temporal framework but not to resolve questions about the synchrony of glaciation on different continents or the duration of the most intense cold phases. As carbon dioxide levels fell and the global temperature dropped, ice began to form at the poles. Under normal circumstances, that ice formation would be self-limiting. As ice spreads toward lower latitudes, the cooling effect of the higher reflectivity is offset by the increased solar energy at lower latitudes, and the ice stops expanding before it reaches the tropics. But if the ice reaches a critical latitude, approximately 30 degrees from the equator according to current climate models, the positive feedback between ice and reflectivity overcomes the stabilizing effect of increased solar energy, and the ice begins to advance unstoppably toward the equator. Once that threshold is crossed, the progression from a planet with polar ice caps to a fully ice-covered planet takes only a few thousand years, which is geologically instantaneous. The trigger that pushed the Earth past that critical latitude may have been the particularly low carbon dioxide levels produced by the prolonged weathering of the Rhodanian rifting margins, combined with a brief reduction in solar luminosity or with a large volcanic eruption that temporarily cooled the atmosphere. The exact trigger is not known and may never be known with certainty, because the geological record does not preserve the kind of high-resolution evidence needed to distinguish between a slow drift past the threshold and a sudden push. What is known is that the threshold was crossed, and that once it was crossed, the global climate system locked into the fully frozen state. The Earth remained in the snowball state for millions of years, held there by the enormous reflectivity of the global ice cover. The geological record suggests that the longest Snowball Earth episode may have lasted for as much as 50 million years. During that time, the surface was effectively uninhabitable. Temperatures at the equator were comparable to those of the modern Antarctic interior. Wind speeds were dramatically higher than anything experienced on the modern Earth, because the temperature difference between the equator and the poles, the primary driver of atmospheric circulation, was reversed. Both were cold, but the tropics were somewhat warmer than the poles, a configuration that produces extremely strong winds. The surface of the frozen ocean was scoured by those winds, and the ice was constantly moving, grinding and fracturing under the stresses of the wind and the underlying ocean circulation. And yet life survived. That is the most astonishing fact about Snowball Earth, and the one that has the most profound implications for our understanding of life's resilience. The organisms that existed on Earth before the Snowball Earth events were primarily single-celled, bacteria, archaea, and simple eukaryotes, the domain of life that includes all cells with a nucleus. Some of those organisms were photosynthetic, using sunlight to produce energy, and the freezing of the ocean surface would have eliminated their primary energy source. Others were chemosynthetic, extracting energy from chemical reactions at hydrothermal vents or in sediments, and those organisms would have been less directly affected by the surface freezing. The most likely refuges for life during Snowball Earth were the hydrothermal vent systems on the ocean floor, where geothermal heat prevented freezing and where chemical energy was available regardless of what was happening at the surface. Those vent systems, which exist today on the mid-ocean ridges and in other volcanically active regions of the seafloor, support complex ecosystems entirely independent of sunlight. During Snowball Earth, they would have been the last refuges of an ocean biosphere that had once covered the entire ocean surface but had been pushed to the margins of survivability. A second possible refuge was beneath thin ice in areas of geothermal heating. Where heat from below kept a thin layer of liquid water under the ice, photosynthetic organisms may have been able to survive in the low light that penetrated through the ice. Thin ice in polar lakes on Earth today supports communities of microorganisms that photosynthesize in the dim light that reaches them through the ice, and analogous communities may have survived the Snowball Earth intervals in areas where geothermal heat kept the ice thin enough to transmit some sunlight. The microorganisms that survived Snowball Earth did not just survive in passive stasis, frozen and waiting for the warmth to return. They actively evolved in their isolated refugia, adapting to conditions that were far more extreme than anything their ancestors had experienced. The genetic analysis of modern extremophiles, organisms that live in hot springs, hypersaline lakes, and other extreme environments, suggests that many of those lineages diverged from more temperate relatives during the Neo-Proterozoic, around the time of the Snowball Earth events. Those organisms were not carried to their extreme habitats by subsequent geological change. They evolved in place, becoming progressively more specialized for the extreme conditions of the refugia in which they found themselves during the glaciation. The organisms that survived Snowball Earth did not merely survive, they evolved. The stress of the extreme environment, combined with the periodic isolation of populations in separate refuges, created conditions that accelerated evolutionary diversification. The genetic evidence from comparisons of modern eukaryotic organisms suggests that several major lineages of complex cells diverged from each other during the Neo-Proterozoic, around the time of the Snowball Earth events. Those divergences may reflect the fragmentation of previously connected populations into isolated refuges, where they evolved independently for millions of years before being brought back into contact when the ice melted. The debate among evolutionary biologists about whether Snowball Earth was primarily a filter that eliminated less resilient lineages, or primarily an accelerator that drove diversification through isolation and stress, is ongoing. The answer may be both. The same events that eliminated the most vulnerable organisms may have simultaneously created the conditions for the diversification of the survivors into the new ecological space that opened when the ice melted. The end of a Snowball Earth episode was as dramatic as its beginning, and in some ways even more extreme. During the millions of years that the Earth was frozen, volcanic outgassing continued to add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Under normal conditions, that carbon dioxide would have been removed by the chemical weathering of exposed rock, as it reacts with rainwater to form carbonic acid that dissolves silicate minerals. But during Snowball Earth, the land was buried under ice and the weathering reactions were essentially halted. Carbon dioxide accumulated in the atmosphere without being removed, reaching concentrations hundreds of times higher than today's levels. When the carbon dioxide concentration reached the level at which its greenhouse effect could overcome the reflectivity of the ice, the warming began. And it did not stop at a comfortable modern climate. The release of the extreme greenhouse conditions, combined with the complete absence of the weathering feedback that normally moderates climate, drove the Earth into a hothouse state almost as extreme as the snowball state that preceded it. Temperatures at the equator may have reached 50 or 60 degrees Celsius in the immediate aftermath of the deglaciation. The oceans, rapidly thawing, would have been subjected to a flood of carbon dioxide and other gases dissolved from the melting ice. The chemistry of the ocean would have changed dramatically and rapidly. The geological record of the immediate post-snowball period contains what geologists call cap carbonates, layers of limestone and dolostone deposited directly on top of the glacial deposits, with no gap in the sedimentary sequence, representing the rapid precipitation of carbonate minerals from an ocean suddenly supersaturated with dissolved carbon dioxide. Those cap carbonates, which are found on every continent wherever Snowball Earth glacial deposits have been identified, are one of the most distinctive signatures of the end of a snowball episode in the geological record. The cap carbonates themselves contain a chemical record of the extreme conditions at the end of Snowball Earth. The carbon isotope values in the cap carbonates are among the most negative ever recorded in marine carbonates anywhere in the geological record, reflecting an ocean in which biological productivity had essentially ceased and in which volcanic carbon was dominating the chemistry of the water. The sulfur isotope record in the same rocks tells a story of an ocean with highly variable oxygen levels, alternating between oxic and anoxic conditions as the biological recovery of the ocean slowly got underway. The chemical signals that the Snowball Earth events left in the ocean sediments are detectable today not just in the carbon isotope record, but in a wide range of other geochemical proxies. The strontium isotope ratio of ancient carbonate rocks reflects the balance between the weathering of continental crust and the hydrothermal circulation of seawater through oceanic crust, and that ratio shifted dramatically during and after the snowball events as the pattern of continental weathering changed. The molybdenum concentration of black shales reflects the oxygenation state of the ancient ocean, and molybdenum data from Neo-Proterozoic shales shows the pattern of oxygen depletion during the glaciation and recovery afterward. Each of those proxy records adds a new dimension to the understanding of the Snowball Earth events, and the consistency of the picture that emerges from independent proxies is one of the strongest arguments for the overall correctness of the hypothesis. The recovery was not immediate. The post-Snowball Earth world was a harsh and chemically extreme environment that challenged the surviving organisms in entirely new ways. The same organisms that had survived the cold now had to survive the heat, the chemical extremes, and the intense ultraviolet radiation that reached the surface when the carbon dioxide levels were high and the ozone layer was disrupted. The survivors of Snowball Earth were, in a very literal sense, organisms that could survive almost anything the Earth could do to them. The connection between Snowball Earth and the Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of complex multicellular animal life in the fossil record approximately 541 million years ago, is one of the most intriguing questions in evolutionary biology. The timing is suggestive. The last major Snowball Earth event, called the Marinoan glaciation, ended approximately 635 million years ago. The Cambrian explosion began approximately 94 million years later. That gap is long enough that the two events might seem unrelated. But in evolutionary time, 94 million years is not an eternity. It is the period during which the first animals with complex body plans were evolving in the oceans of the late Neo-Proterozoic, diversifying in the aftermath of the Snowball Earth events and producing the extraordinary variety of forms that would burst into the fossil record at the base of the Cambrian. The hypothesis that Snowball Earth drove the evolution of complex multicellular life operates through several mechanisms. The most direct is the oxygenation of the ocean. During Snowball Earth, the freezing of the ocean surface cut off the exchange of oxygen between the atmosphere and the ocean water, producing widespread anoxic conditions in the deep ocean. When the ice melted, the reoxygenation of the ocean was rapid and dramatic, and the elevated oxygen levels in the post-Snowball ocean may have been a critical enabling factor for the evolution of large, metabolically active multicellular organisms that require more oxygen per unit of body volume than single cells. The phosphorus cycle hypothesis offers another mechanism. Phosphorus is an essential nutrient for all life, and its availability in the ocean limits the productivity of marine ecosystems. During Snowball Earth, the intense continental weathering that occurred when the ice melted would have released enormous quantities of phosphorus from the exposed rock into the ocean, producing a pulse of nutrient availability that could have fueled an explosion of biological productivity and evolutionary diversification. The selective pressure hypothesis suggests that the extreme conditions of Snowball Earth selected for organisms with new capabilities, including multicellularity, which confers advantages in stress tolerance, the ability to consume other organisms rather than just dissolved nutrients, and the ability to coordinate the behavior of many cells for functions that no single cell could perform. The organisms that emerged from the Snowball Earth crucible may have been fundamentally different from those that entered it, having evolved new strategies for survival that made the Cambrian explosion not just possible but inevitable. Whether any of these mechanisms was actually responsible for the timing of the Cambrian explosion is not settled. The relationship between Snowball Earth and the Cambrian explosion is a correlation in time, and correlation is not causation. But the hypothesis that the most extreme climate event in Earth history was also one of the most important events in the history of life is one of the most compelling ideas in modern Earth science, and the evidence for it is growing with each new study of the Neoproterozoic geological record. The Ediacaran biota that appears in the fossil record after the Marinoan deglaciation represents a world that was trying to rebuild its biological complexity after the most severe disruption in the history of complex life. The Ediacaran organisms, which range from flat frond-like forms to disc-shaped structures to complex quilted organisms that do not resemble any living animal group, were the first complex multicellular organisms to achieve global distribution, preserved in soft sediment environments on every continent. Their body plans are so unfamiliar that their relationships to living animal groups have been debated for decades. Some may be early relatives of living animal phyla, others may represent evolutionary experiments that left no descendants. They are the first characters in the story of animal life, and their appearance in the rocks immediately following the end of Snowball Earth is one of the clearest signals that the post-glacial world was fundamentally different from the one that preceded it. The Snowball Earth hypothesis has not gone unchallenged since it was proposed in its modern form in the 1990s. The most serious alternative hypothesis is called Slushball Earth, and it suggests that the glaciation, while global in extent, was not complete, that the tropical ocean remained partially open, covered in thin ice rather than the kilometer-thick ice of the full snowball model. The slushball hypothesis was motivated partly by biological concerns. The complete freezing of the ocean, as the full snowball model requires, would seem to leave very little room for the survival of photosynthetic organisms, and yet the continuity of the eukaryotic lineage through the Snowball Earth events implies that photosynthesis was maintained somewhere. If the tropical ocean remained open, or was covered only in thin ice, then photosynthetic organisms could have survived in those ice-free or thin ice zones, maintaining the ecological foundation for the rapid biological recovery observed after the glaciation ended. The debate between the snowball and slushball models has been productive for science regardless of which model is ultimately correct, because it has driven researchers to look more carefully at the evidence and to develop more sophisticated climate models capable of simulating the extreme conditions of the Neoproterozoic. Those models have revealed that the climate of the frozen Earth was more complex than the simple snowball picture suggests. The behavior of the ice, the circulation of the atmosphere and ocean beneath and above the ice, and the distribution of geothermal heat all contributed to a climate system that was heterogeneous rather than uniform. The current scientific consensus, to the extent that one can be identified, is that the full Snowball Earth model is more consistent with the geological evidence than the slushball alternative, but that the frozen Earth was not uniformly frozen everywhere all the time. Areas near active volcanic systems may have maintained thin ice or even open water. Areas where geothermal heat was concentrated may have had liquid water at the surface even in the depth of the glaciation. The Earth during Snowball Earth was not a perfectly uniform white ball. It was a white ball with patches of thin ice and occasional leads of open water, supporting isolated refuges of life in a world that was otherwise as hostile to living things as any environment that has ever existed on Earth. The debate also extends to the question of how many Snowball Earth events occurred. The most clearly documented events are the Sturtian glaciation, which began approximately 717 million years ago and lasted for approximately 50 million years, and the Marinoan glaciation, which ended approximately 635 million years ago and may have been somewhat shorter. Some researchers have proposed a third, earlier event called the Kaigas glaciation, and possibly additional events before that. The evidence for those earlier events is less complete than for the Sturtian and Marinoan, but the possibility of repeated global glaciations through the Neoproterozoic has implications for models of how life evolved through those extreme periods. The implications of Snowball Earth extend far beyond the Precambrian. They touch on some of the most fundamental questions about the long-term stability of Earth's climate and the conditions under which complex life can exist. The most unsettling implication is that the climate system of the Earth contains a bistable state, a fully frozen state that, once entered, is self-perpetuating until enough volcanic carbon dioxide accumulates to trigger a catastrophic warming. That frozen state has been entered at least twice in the known history of the planet. The question of whether it could be entered again, and under what conditions, is not merely academic. The relationship between continental configuration and climate sensitivity during the Neo-Proterozoic has been explored through a series of climate modeling studies that attempt to reproduce the conditions that led to the Snowball Earth glaciations. Those models consistently find that the concentration of continents at low latitudes, as occurred during the breakup of Rodinia, significantly increases the sensitivity of the climate to reductions in greenhouse gas concentrations. The mechanism involves the higher weathering rates of tropical continental rocks compared with polar rocks. More continental area in the tropics means more weathering, more carbon dioxide drawdown, and a greater tendency for the climate to cool past the threshold for runaway glaciation. Those model results suggest that the Snowball Earth events were not merely the result of a temporary fluctuation in greenhouse gas levels, but were made possible by the specific continental configuration of the Neo-Proterozoic, a configuration that does not exist today and that is unlikely to exist again in the foreseeable geological future. The answer, reassuringly, is that the current climate is not close to the snowball threshold. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today is far higher than the levels that triggered the Neo-Proterozoic glaciations, and the feedback mechanisms that might drive runaway glaciation are not operating. The concern of contemporary climate science is the opposite runaway, a runaway warming that drives the Earth toward a hothouse state rather than a snowball state. But understanding the snowball mechanism helps to calibrate our understanding of how extreme the climate system can be, and how quickly it can change when positive feedback mechanisms take over from the negative ones that normally maintain stability. The Snowball Earth events also provide a crucial calibration point for the history of atmospheric oxygen. The oxygenation of the Earth's atmosphere, which began approximately 2.4 billion years ago with the Great Oxidation Event and reached its modern levels over a complex history of subsequent changes, is intimately connected with the history of the carbon cycle and with the biological productivity of the ocean. The Snowball Earth events disrupted that carbon cycle in profound ways, and the recovery of biological productivity after each deglaciation contributed to the oxygenation events that preceded the evolution of complex multicellular life. The sequence of Snowball Earth events and atmospheric oxygenation events is not a coincidence. They are part of the same story of the coevolution of the Earth's surface environment and the life that inhabits it. The Snowball Earth hypothesis has also changed the way planetary scientists think about habitability on other worlds. If the Earth, which has a star at just the right distance and the right chemical composition, could enter a snowball state and maintain it for tens of millions of years, then the concept of the habitable zone around other stars, the range of orbital distances at which liquid water can exist on a planetary surface, needs to be understood as a range of conditions rather than a simple criterion. A planet in the habitable zone could still be frozen solid if its carbon cycle is disrupted in the right way. And a planet outside the conventional habitable zone might maintain liquid water at hydrothermal vents even when its surface is frozen. Snowball Earth has expanded the conceptual space of habitability in ways that are relevant to the search for life elsewhere in the universe. The search for life on icy moons in our own solar system is directly informed by what we know about Snowball Earth. Europa, the moon of Jupiter with a subsurface ocean beneath its icy crust, and Enceladus, the moon of Saturn that is actively venting water and organic compounds from its subsurface ocean into space, are the most promising candidates for extraterrestrial life in the solar system. Both of them present a situation that is analogous in important ways to Snowball Earth, a body of liquid water sealed beneath a surface of ice, cut off from direct sunlight but potentially harboring life near geothermal heat sources at the ocean floor. The organisms that survived Snowball Earth by retreating to hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor are, in that sense, a model for what life on Europa or Enceladus might look like. Life that exists entirely below the ice, entirely independent of sunlight, sustained by chemical energy from the reaction between water and rock, is not hypothetical. It exists today in hydrothermal vent communities and in deep subsurface environments on Earth. The fact that life survived Snowball Earth in such environments demonstrates that the subsurface aquatic ecosystem is a viable long-term ecological strategy, and that strategy is exactly what the potential life on icy moons would need to employ. The space missions currently planned or under development to explore Europa and Enceladus are therefore not just missions to search for life in the outer solar system. They are, in a sense, missions to find the analogs of the organisms that survived Snowball Earth, preserved in environments that may have remained stable for billions of years. If life on Earth could survive in isolated pockets of liquid water while the surface was completely frozen, then life in the subsurface oceans of icy moons, which have been stable for billions of years, is entirely plausible by the same logic. The evidence for Snowball Earth in ocean sediment cores has been harder to find than the evidence in continental rocks, partly because the oldest oceanic crust on Earth is approximately 200 million years old, much younger than the Neo-Proterozoic. The ocean floor that existed during Snowball Earth has long since been subducted back into the mantle and is gone. The ocean sediments of the Neo-Proterozoic are preserved only in ophiolites, ancient pieces of oceanic crust that were scraped off the subducting plate and accreted onto continental margins rather than being pulled down into the mantle. Those ophiolitic sequences, found in mountain belts on every continent, preserve fragments of the Neo-Proterozoic ocean floor in which the chemical and biological signals of the Snowball Earth events are recorded, though in a form that is more difficult to read than the continental sediment sequences. That connection between the frozen Earth of 700 million years ago and the icy moons of the outer solar system is one of the most unexpected products of the Snowball Earth research program. The scientists who first proposed the hypothesis were trying to explain geological anomalies in rocks. They ended up providing one of the strongest arguments for searching for life in the outer solar system, and one of the most detailed models of what that life might look like and where it might be found. The organisms that survived Snowball Earth did not know they were doing something that would eventually guide spacecraft engineers and astrobiologists in the 21st century. They were simply surviving, as life always does, by finding the warmth and the energy that were available to them in a world that had tried its best to freeze them out of existence. That stubbornness, that refusal of life to be eliminated even by the most extreme conditions the Earth can produce, is the thread that connects the Neo-Proterozoic vent communities to the potential life on Europa to the humans who are trying to find it. The story of Snowball Earth is also, on reflection, a story about perspective. From the perspective of the individual organisms that lived through it, if organisms can be said to have a perspective in any meaningful sense, Snowball Earth was an extinction event of almost incomprehensible severity. The vast majority of the life that existed before the glaciation was eliminated. The ecosystems that had developed over the previous hundreds of millions of years were destroyed. The diversity of the Neo-Proterozoic biosphere, limited as it was compared with what followed, was reduced to isolated pockets of survivors huddling near hydrothermal vents in a world covered in ice. From the perspective of the history of life, however, Snowball Earth was something else, the crucible in which the raw material of complexity was forged. The selective pressures of the frozen world, the isolation of populations in separate refuges, the chemical extremes of the deglaciation, and the oxygenation pulse that followed may have been the necessary preconditions for the evolution of the complex multicellular animals that would eventually fill the Cambrian oceans. Without Snowball Earth, the Cambrian explosion might not have happened. Without the Cambrian explosion, there would be no fish, no amphibians, no reptiles, no mammals, no us. That is a contingency so deep that it becomes difficult to hold in mind without a kind of vertigo. We exist because the Earth froze 700 million years ago. We exist because the organisms that survived that freezing were changed by it in ways that made complex life possible. We are the product of the most extreme climate catastrophe in the history of the planet, filtered through hundreds of millions of years of evolution that the catastrophe made possible. The geological record that tells us this story is itself remarkable. The rocks of the Neo-Proterozoic, outcropping on every continent, have been patiently preserving the evidence of Snowball Earth for 700 million years, waiting for a species capable of reading it to arrive. That species arrived approximately 300,000 years ago. It took another 299,000 years or so before one member of that species, Brian Harland, looked at a rock and saw in it the evidence of something that should have been impossible. And it took another 30 years before the scientific community had assembled enough evidence to accept that what the rocks were saying was true. The potential for future climate extremes, including runaway warming scenarios that are more relevant to the current situation than the Snowball Earth scenario, is illuminated by understanding the mechanisms that produced the snowball. The key insight from Snowball Earth research is that the climate system contains threshold behaviors, states that are self-reinforcing once entered and that require a substantial change in forcing to exit. The transition from the snowball state to the hothouse state at the end of the glaciation was driven by the accumulation of volcanic carbon dioxide to levels hundreds of times higher than today, and the transition was sudden. The geological record shows no gradual warming but a rapid shift from full glaciation to full deglaciation over a period of perhaps a few thousand years. Those threshold behaviors in the climate system, with their potential for rapid and irreversible transitions, are among the most important findings of the Snowball Earth research program for contemporary climate science. The Earth froze. Life survived. Complex life evolved. And the descendants of those survivors are now piecing together, from the rocks and the isotopes and the magnetic signatures, the story of what their ancestors endured. That is one of the most extraordinary intellectual achievements in the history of science, and it is also one of the most humbling. The discovery that we owe our existence to a catastrophe that happened before our most distant animal ancestors had evolved. The rocks tell the story. The isotopes confirm it. The fossils show the aftermath. And the living world, in every cell of every organism, carries the genetic memory of having passed through the fire, or in this case, the ice. The research into Snowball Earth continues to produce new findings that refine and sometimes challenge the original picture. The Sturtian glaciation, the older and longer of the two main snowball events, has received increasing attention in recent years as researchers have recognized that it may have lasted even longer than originally thought. New radiometric dates from glacial deposits on multiple continents suggest that the Sturtian glaciation may have begun as early as 717 million years ago and lasted until approximately 660 million years ago, a duration of 57 million years that makes it by far the longest glaciation in Earth history. The implications of a 57 million year glaciation for the evolution of life and for the carbon cycle are still being worked out, but they underscore the extraordinary severity of the Snowball Earth conditions. The discovery of microfossils in Neo-Proterozoic rocks has added a biological dimension to the Snowball Earth story that was largely absent from the original hypothesis. The fossils of the Ediacaran biota, the soft-bodied multicellular organisms that appear in the fossil record after the Marinoan deglaciation, have been intensively studied since the 1950s and are now understood as the first complex multicellular organisms to achieve global distribution. But recent paleontological work has pushed the evidence for complex multicellularity back before the Marinoan glaciation, into the interval between the Sturtian and Marinoan events, suggesting that the evolution of the first complex multicellular organisms was already underway before the last Snowball Earth event, rather than being triggered by it. That finding complicates the simple narrative in which Snowball Earth causes the evolution of complex life. Instead, it suggests a more intricate relationship. Complex multicellular life was beginning to evolve before the last snowball event, was severely set back by that event, and then recovered and diversified rapidly in its aftermath. The Snowball Earth events may have been a filter that shaped the direction of the evolution of complex life without being the sole cause of it, eliminating some lineages, allowing others to survive and evolve, and creating new ecological opportunities in the post-glacial world that accelerated the diversification of the surviving groups. The chemical weathering that occurred during the rapid deglaciation at the end of Snowball Earth events has also been studied in increasing detail, and it turns out to have been far more intense than previously estimated. The combination of high atmospheric carbon dioxide, warm temperatures, and the exposure of fresh rock surfaces that had been sealed under ice for tens of millions of years created conditions for chemical weathering that have no analog in the modern world. The products of that weathering, including large pulses of phosphorus, iron, and other biologically essential elements, were delivered to the ocean in quantities and at rates that would have been extraordinary by any standard. The biological response to that flood of nutrients may have been one of the key triggers of the Cambrian explosion, connecting the end of Snowball Earth to the beginning of animal diversity through the chemistry of the post-glacial ocean. There is a dimension of the Snowball Earth story that is rarely discussed, but that deserves attention. What the frozen Earth looked like, what it sounded like, what it felt like at the surface, if any hypothetical observer could have been placed there. The philosophical implications of Snowball Earth are profound in a way that takes time to fully appreciate. We are accustomed to thinking of the Earth as a stable, welcoming environment for life, fine-tuned by billions of years of biological evolution to support the extraordinary diversity of life we see today. Snowball Earth reveals that this stability is recent, that the Earth has been deeply inhospitable to complex life for most of its history, and that the comfortable environment we inhabit is the product of a specific combination of geological and atmospheric conditions that has prevailed for only a relatively brief period. The Cambrian explosion, which produced the first complex animals, occurred approximately 540 million years ago. Complex life has therefore existed on Earth for only about 12% of the total age of the planet. The other 88% was a world without animals, without forests, without the kind of biological complexity that we take for granted as the definition of life. The sky above Snowball Earth would have been extraordinarily clear. The frozen surface would have eliminated the evaporation of ocean water that keeps the modern atmosphere humid, and the air would have been extremely dry. Dust, carried by the fierce winds from the exposed rocky nunataks that protruded through the ice at the highest elevations, would have been the primary aerosol in an atmosphere otherwise almost entirely free of water vapor. The sun, when it crossed the sky, would have appeared brighter and harsher than on the modern Earth, because there would have been no moisture to scatter its light into the diffuse blueness of the sky we know. The wind would have been relentless. The temperature gradient between the equator and the poles, which drives the atmospheric circulation of the modern Earth, was eliminated on Snowball Earth. Both poles and equator were cold, and the variation in temperature across latitudes was much smaller than today. That flattening of the temperature gradient would have changed the character of the atmospheric circulation, potentially producing strong winds that were more uniformly distributed across the planet rather than concentrated in the jet streams and trade winds of the modern atmosphere. Researchers who have modeled the wind patterns of Snowball Earth estimate that average surface winds were significantly stronger than those of the modern world. The color of the surface would have been predominantly white, but not uniformly white. The ice was not smooth. It was fractured, ridged, and shaped by the wind into complex patterns of sastrugi and pressure ridges. In the low light of the polar regions, those features would have cast long shadows, giving the ice surface a texture and depth that would have distinguished it from the flat uniformity it appears to have from space. Near the equator, where the ice was thinnest and where geothermal heat occasionally melted it from below, there may have been areas of darker ice, blue or gray rather than white, that would have broken the monotony of the global white. The sound environment of Snowball Earth, if one could call it that, would have been dominated by the sound of ice. The creaking and groaning of ice under pressure. The sharp reports of thermal contraction as the ice cooled on the polar nights. the grinding of ice moving across bedrock, the howl of wind across the surface. And beneath all of that, the silence of a world without biological sound. No insects, no birds, no marine mammals, no rustling of leaves, no sound of rain or of running water, because the rain had stopped falling and the rivers had long since frozen. The Snowball Earth story also connects to the everyday world in ways that are less obvious than the grand narrative of global freezing and the origins of complex life. The iron ore deposits that power the steel industry, which in turn underlies virtually all of modern infrastructure, were formed primarily during another extreme period of Earth history called the Great Oxidation Event, approximately 2.4 billion years ago. But some of the most economically significant iron ore deposits are from the Neo-Proterozoic and are directly associated with the Snowball Earth events. The glacial erosion of Snowball Earth scraped enormous quantities of iron-bearing rock from the continental surfaces and deposited it in the ocean, where it was eventually oxidized and precipitated as iron oxide. Those iron deposits, now exposed in regions that have been uplifted by subsequent geological activity, are among the richest iron ore deposits on Earth. The phosphate deposits that are the primary source of the phosphorus used in agricultural fertilizers are also partly of Neo-Proterozoic origin, associated with the chemical weathering pulses that followed the Snowball Earth deglaciations. The extraordinary productivity of the post-Snowball ocean, fueled by the flood of nutrients from the deglaciation, produced organic-rich sediments that were enriched in phosphorus, and some of those sediments were subsequently concentrated into deposits that are economically exploitable today. The food security of the modern world depends in part on phosphorus that was concentrated in the ocean by the aftermath of the last global glaciation. The nitrogen cycle during Snowball Earth is another aspect of the geochemistry of the frozen world that is being studied with increasing sophistication. Nitrogen is an essential element for all life, and its cycling between the atmosphere, the ocean, and the biosphere is one of the fundamental processes of Earth's biochemistry. During Snowball Earth, the freezing of the ocean surface would have cut off the exchange of nitrogen compounds between the atmosphere and the ocean, and the reduction of biological activity in the ocean would have slowed the biological nitrogen fixation and denitrification reactions that normally maintain the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen isotope record in Neo-Proterozoic sediments shows signatures consistent with those disruptions, and the recovery of the nitrogen cycle after the deglaciation is one of the indicators of the biological recovery of the post-Snowball ocean. The oil and gas deposits of the Neo-Proterozoic are less extensive than those of the Mesozoic or Paleozoic, but they exist and they are exploited in several parts of the world. The organic-rich sediments deposited in the post-Snowball oceans, where high biological productivity left abundant organic material on the seafloor, have in some regions been buried and heated to the temperatures required to generate petroleum. Those deposits are reminders that the extreme biological productivity of the post-Snowball world left a chemical legacy that persists to the present day. The connection between the most ancient climate events and the most mundane aspects of modern economic life, between the freezing of the entire Earth 700 million years ago and the steel in a modern building or the phosphate in a grain of fertilizer, is one of the more unexpected products of deep-time geology. The Earth's past is not merely history. It is the foundation of the material economy of the present, and understanding it is a practical as well as an intellectual enterprise. The scientists who study Snowball Earth work in some of the most remote field locations on Earth, tracing the traces of the ancient glaciation in rocks that outcrop in Namibia, Oman, China, Australia, Canada, and Scandinavia. The field work is not glamorous. It involves long drives or hikes to remote outcrops, careful geological mapping of rock exposures that may be only a few meters across, and the systematic collection of samples that will be analyzed in laboratories months or years later. The rocks themselves are unremarkable to the untrained eye, gray and beige layered sequences of carbonate and siliciclastic sediment that give no immediate visual indication of the extraordinary story they contain. Reading that story requires a combination of geological knowledge, chemical analysis, and the ability to reconstruct ancient environments from the faintest of clues preserved in the mineralogy and geochemistry of ancient seafloor sediments. The Elatina Formation of South Australia is one of the best-studied Snowball Earth sequences in the world. It outcrops in the Flinders Ranges, a mountain chain in the interior of South Australia that has been a classic location for Precambrian geology since the 19th century. The glacial deposits of the Elatina Formation and the cap carbonates of the overlying Nuckalina Formation have been studied in detail for decades, and they contain some of the most complete records of the Marinoan deglaciation available anywhere in the world. The researchers who work on those rocks are continuing a tradition of investigation that goes back to the earliest days of Precambrian geology, each generation adding a new layer of analytical precision to the understanding of what happened there 635 million years ago. The international collaboration required to assemble the global picture of Snowball Earth, connecting the geological records of every continent into a coherent temporal and spatial framework, has been one of the most ambitious projects in the history of geology. The correlation of sequences separated by thousands of kilometers requires precise radiometric dating, consistent stratigraphic methodology, and years of communication and cross-checking between research groups working on different continents. That collaboration has produced a picture of Snowball Earth that is more detailed and more robust than anything that could have been assembled by any single research group working in isolation, and it has established a model for international geological research that is being applied to other major events in Earth history. The Snowball Earth Research Program is also a reminder of how long geological understanding can take to develop. The evidence for tropical glaciation was first recognized in the 19th century. The paleomagnetic confirmation of tropical glaciation latitudes was achieved in the mid-20th century. The coherent global picture was assembled in the 1990s. The detailed mechanism and timing are still being refined in the 2020s. The story of Snowball Earth has been assembled over more than a century of scientific effort by hundreds of researchers on every continent, using techniques ranging from the simple hammer and hand lens of the 19th century field geologist to the most sophisticated mass spectrometers and computational climate models of the 21st century. The Snowball Earth Research Program has also contributed to the development of new analytical techniques in geology and geochemistry. The need to extract precise chronological and environmental information from ancient, often poorly preserved rocks has driven innovations in mass spectrometry, in the analysis of trace element and isotopic compositions of carbonate minerals, and in the dating of small quantities of material using uranium lead methods in tiny zircon crystals. Those techniques, developed for the specific challenges of Neo-Proterozoic geology, have subsequently been applied to other problems in Earth history and have become standard tools in the analytical toolkit of modern geology. The Snowball Earth Research Program has therefore had an impact on the practice of geology that extends well beyond its specific scientific conclusions. Tonight, as sleep approaches, the Earth you are living on carries the evidence of Snowball Earth in its rocks, in its oceans, and in the biology of every living thing. The oldest lineages of eukaryotic life, the cells that eventually gave rise to plants, fungi, and animals, diverged from each other during or after the Snowball Earth events. The genetic distances between those lineages, measured in the rates of molecular clock mutations, are consistent with the timing of the Snowball Earth glaciations. The deepest branches of the tree of life that includes every complex organism on Earth were shaped by the selection pressures of the frozen world. The biology of every animal that has ever lived, including you, reflects the evolutionary response to a world that tried to freeze life out of existence and failed. The carbonate rocks that were deposited in the post-snowball oceans are exposed today in mountain ranges on every continent, from the Alps to the Rockies to the Himalayas, and they tell the same story everywhere. A rapid deglaciation, a chemically extreme ocean, a burst of biological productivity, and the beginning of the Ediacaran world in which complex multicellular life first established itself. Those rocks are the physical evidence of the transition from a world without animals to a world that would eventually contain everything from jellyfish to elephants to the organisms writing and reading this documentary. The understanding of Snowball Earth has also changed the way we think about Earth's future. The carbon dioxide that humans are adding to the atmosphere is, in the very long run, being countered by the slow chemical weathering of exposed rock, the same process that drew down carbon dioxide and triggered the Snowball Earth events in the first place. Over geological timescales of tens of millions of years, the carbon cycle will eventually rebalance, sequestering the excess carbon and cooling the climate. That is a slow comfort. The geological carbon cycle operates on timescales that are irrelevant to human civilization. But it is a reminder that the Earth is a self-regulating system, operating on timescales that dwarf our own, with mechanisms of recovery that have reset the climate after every extreme event in the planet's history. The Earth froze completely. Life survived. Complex life evolved from the survivors. And here we are, 700 million years later, trying to understand what happened. That chain of contingencies, from the first ice crystal that began the snowball glaciation to the human brain capable of reconstructing the story, is as close as geology comes to a narrative with a protagonist. The protagonist is not any individual organism or species. It is life itself, stubborn and adaptive and impossible to fully extinguish, finding its way through a frozen world to the extraordinary diversity of the living planet we inhabit tonight. The Snowball Earth events are also a reminder of the extraordinary resilience embedded in the simplest forms of life. The organisms that survived the frozen world were not complex or large or intelligent. They were single-celled, metabolically flexible, capable of dormancy and of living on chemical energy in the absence of sunlight. Those apparently humble characteristics were precisely what allowed them to survive conditions that would instantly kill any complex organism. The simplest life is often the hardest to destroy, and the deep history of the biosphere reflects that asymmetry repeatedly. The more complex the organism, the more vulnerable it is to disruption. The simpler the organism, the more likely it is to survive. That inversion of the intuitive relationship between complexity and resilience is one of the most important lessons that the history of life has to teach. Tonight, the ice at the poles is moving. Not at the rate it moved during Snowball Earth, but moving nonetheless, responding to the forces of a climate system that is being perturbed in new ways. The history recorded in the Neo-Proterozoic rocks does not prescribe a particular future, but it describes the range of what the climate system is capable of, and that description is one of the most important pieces of knowledge that earth science has produced. We know the Earth can freeze completely. We know it can overheat dramatically. We know life can survive both extremes. And we know that the transitions between those states, when they come, are rapid beyond anything human civilization has experienced. Sleep now with that knowledge, and with the thought that the organisms whose descendants you are survived something far worse than anything the present moment can offer. Sleep now, knowing that you exist because the Earth once tried to eliminate all life and could not. That is, in its way, the most reassuring fact in the history of this planet. The rate of carbon dioxide accumulation during the Snowball Earth intervals provides a useful perspective on the current rate of greenhouse gas increase. During the millions of years that the Earth was frozen, volcanic outgassing added carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at a rate of perhaps a few 100 million tons per year, a rate that was sufficient to accumulate the concentrations needed to end the glaciation over tens of millions of years. Human activities are currently adding approximately 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere per year. The geological carbon cycle is being accelerated by a factor of roughly 100 relative to the natural rate that ended Snowball Earth. That comparison does not mean that a post-snowball deglaciation is imminent. The climate system today is in a very different state from the frozen Earth of the Neo-Proterozoic, and the feedback mechanisms operating are different. But it does illustrate, in a visceral way, the geological scale of the perturbation that human activities are imposing on the carbon cycle. The organisms of the Ediacaran period, the 60 million years between the end of Snowball Earth and the beginning of the Cambrian, had to navigate a world that was chemically and ecologically unprecedented. The oceans they inhabited were recovering from the extreme conditions of the glaciation and the deglaciation, with oxygen levels, nutrient concentrations, and water chemistry all in flux. The organisms that succeeded in that world were those that could tolerate variable conditions, exploit new ecological niches as they opened, and develop the cellular machinery for the new biological strategies, including predation, motility, and complex body plans that would define animal life. The Ediacaran is the testing ground of animal evolution, the period during which the innovations that would produce the Cambrian explosion were being developed and refined in organisms that were already complex by any reasonable standard, but that lacked the hard parts that would preserve them abundantly in the fossil record of subsequent periods. The interaction between the Snowball Earth events and the evolution of photosynthesis is one of the more speculative but potentially important aspects of the Snowball story. The first photosynthetic organisms, which appeared approximately 2.7 billion years ago, fundamentally changed the chemistry of the Earth's surface environment by adding oxygen to an atmosphere that had previously contained almost none. The Snowball Earth events may have played a role in the subsequent history of photosynthesis by forcing the diversification of photosynthetic strategies among the organisms that survived in the limited light environments of thin ice and shallow geothermal zones. The lineages that survived may have been those with the most flexible photosynthetic machinery, capable of harvesting light efficiently at very low intensities, and those lineages may have been the direct ancestors of the green algae and cyanobacteria that would go on to dominate the post-snowball oceans and eventually, after a further billion years of evolution, colonize the land as plants. The role of sea ice in modern climate models is directly informed by the study of Snowball Earth, because the physics of sea ice formation, growth, and decay is the same regardless of whether the ice is extending to cover the modern Arctic Ocean or the ancient Neo-Proterozoic tropics. The techniques developed to study sea ice dynamics in the context of Snowball Earth research have been incorporated into the global climate models used to project future Arctic and Antarctic sea ice coverage, contributing to the accuracy of projections that are used by policymakers to plan infrastructure, manage agricultural risk, and negotiate international climate agreements. The Snowball Earth research program has therefore had practical impacts on contemporary decision-making through its contribution to the development of better climate models. The deep-sea organisms that survived the Snowball Earth events at hydrothermal vents were, in a sense, the guardians of the biological information accumulated over the preceding 2 billion years of evolution. Every lineage of complex life that exists today, from bacteria to blue whales, descended from organisms that passed through the Snowball Earth filter. The molecular clock analysis of modern organisms, which uses the rate of mutation accumulation to estimate when lineages diverged from each other, consistently places the divergence of the major lineages of complex eukaryotic life in the Neo-Proterozoic around the time of the Snowball Earth events. Those dates suggest that the frozen world was not only a filter that eliminated vulnerable lineages, but a forge in which the lineages that survived were shaped and differentiated by the stresses of the extreme environment. The Snowball Earth research program has also produced insights that are relevant to the broader question of how life can affect the habitability of the planet it inhabits. The original trigger of the snowball events was almost certainly the drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide by the weathering of continental silicate rocks, a process that was accelerated by the biological activity of the Neo-Proterozoic biosphere itself. Photosynthetic organisms in the ocean and on land were consuming carbon dioxide and generating organic matter that was buried in sediments, removing greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. In this sense, life contributed to the conditions that nearly eliminated it. the biological carbon pump that was essential to the productivity of the Neoproterozoic biosphere, also drew down the greenhouse gas that kept the planet warm. That deep interconnection between biological activity and planetary habitability is one of the central themes of Earth system science, and Snowball Earth is one of its most dramatic illustrations. The Cambrian explosion, when it finally came approximately 94 million years after the end of the last Snowball Earth event, was not the explosion of simple organisms into complexity, but the explosion of already complex organisms into diversity. The evidence for complex multicellular life in the Ediacaran period makes it clear that by the time the Cambrian began, the innovations needed for animal body plans, cell specialization, tissue organization, nervous systems, and sensory organs were already in place or actively being developed. What happened at the base of the Cambrian was therefore not the invention of complexity, but the radiation of complex forms into an ecological and environmental space that had been opened by the recovery of the oceans and the stabilization of the climate after the Snowball Earth events. The explosion was real, but it was the product of a long preparation, and that preparation had been driven in large part by the selection pressures of the most extreme climate event in Earth history. The preservation of Snowball Earth evidence in the geological record is itself remarkable, because the processes of weathering, erosion, and metamorphism that transform and destroy rocks over geological time have had 700 million years to work on the Neoproterozoic sequences. The fact that recognizable glacial deposits, complete with cap carbonates and the associated geochemical signatures, survive on every continent is a testament to the robustness of the evidence and to the accident of geological preservation that has exposed those ancient sequences at the surface where we can find and study them. Many more Neoproterozoic sequences have undoubtedly been destroyed by subsequent geological processes, and the ones we have are a sample biased toward rocks that were deposited in tectonically stable regions and that have been minimally altered by the heat and pressure of burial and metamorphism. The emotional register of the Snowball Earth story, if science can be said to have an emotional register, is one of extremity and improbability. The extreme cold, the extreme isolation of life in its refugia, the extreme chemical changes of the deglaciation, and above all, the extreme improbability that any of this led to us. The path from the hydrothermal vent communities of Snowball Earth to a species capable of reconstructing the story of Snowball Earth runs through an enormous number of contingencies, each of which could have gone differently and each of which was shaped by the selection pressures of the frozen world. The Cambrian explosion, the Permian extinction, the asteroid that ended the dinosaurs, the cooling of the African climate that drove the evolution of our hominin ancestors, every step along the way was contingent and unpredictable. Snowball Earth was the first and perhaps the most extreme of those contingencies. Everything that followed depended on what survived it. The isotopic composition of ancient seawater can be read not just from bulk sediment analyses, but from the individual crystals of carbonate minerals within ancient rocks. The technique of clumped isotope thermometry, developed in the 2000s, analyzes the tendency of heavy isotopes of carbon and oxygen to bond with each other in carbonate minerals rather than with lighter isotopes. That tendency depends on temperature in a way that can be calibrated in modern carbonates and then applied to ancient ones, allowing researchers to estimate the temperature at which ancient carbonate minerals formed. Applied to Neoproterozoic cap carbonates, clumped isotope thermometry has provided direct temperature estimates for the post-snowball ocean that are consistent with the extremely warm conditions predicted by the theoretical models of post-glacial warming, providing one of the most direct confirmations of the temperature extremes that followed the melting of the global ice cover. The sulfur cycle during Snowball Earth is another dimension of the geochemistry that has been extensively studied. Sulfur has 4 stable isotopes, and the ratios between them in marine sediments reflect the activity of sulfate-reducing bacteria in the sediment and in the water column. During normal periods, those bacteria produce sulfide with a distinctive isotopic signature that leaves a detectable imprint in the sulfur isotope record of marine sediments. During Snowball Earth, The reduction of biological activity and the unusual chemical conditions of the frozen ocean produced sulfur isotope signals that are distinctive from those of both the preceding and following periods, providing another independent geochemical marker of the snowball intervals. The sulfur isotope record in Neoproterozoic black shales has been instrumental in constraining the extent and duration of the anoxic conditions that characterized the glaciated ocean. The concept of deep time, the geological understanding that the Earth is billions of years old and that the history recorded in rocks extends far beyond anything that human civilization can directly know, is nowhere more vividly illustrated than in the Snowball Earth story. The events of 700 million years ago are not merely distant in time. They are distant in a way that makes all of human history, all of the recorded past and likely future of our civilization, seem like a brief moment at the end of a very long story. And yet those distant events are directly relevant to our existence. We are here because of what happened during the Neoproterozoic. We can trace the lineage of every cell in our bodies back to organisms that survived the frozen world. Deep time is not merely the backdrop against which human history plays out. It is the process that produced the conditions that made human history possible. The discovery of stromatolites, layered structures built by communities of cyanobacteria, in rocks that postdate the Snowball Earth events provides evidence of the continuity of photosynthetic life through the glaciation. Stromatolites had been the dominant biological structures in marine environments for more than 2 billion years before the Snowball events, and they continued to appear in the rock record after the glaciation ended, demonstrating that the cyanobacterial lineage that builds them survived. More recent molecular clock analyses suggest that the cyanobacterial lineage that eventually gave rise to the chloroplasts of modern plant cells diverged from other cyanobacterial lineages around the time of the Neoproterozoic, possibly during or shortly after the Snowball events. That divergence, which produced the specific lineage of photosynthetic bacteria that would eventually be engulfed by a eukaryotic cell and become the chloroplast, may be one of the most consequential evolutionary events in the history of the biosphere. The concept of refugia, habitats that remain inhabitable during periods of global environmental stress, is one of the most important concepts in conservation biology, and Snowball Earth provides its most dramatic historical illustration. Modern conservation biology uses the concept of refugia to identify regions that maintained viable populations of species through past glaciation events and that may therefore harbor greater genetic diversity than regions that were recolonized from those refugia after the ice retreated. The genetic diversity of many modern species is distributed in patterns that reflect the location of Ice Age refugia in the last 2 million years. The Snowball Earth refugia operated on the same principle, scaled up by several orders of magnitude. The organisms that survived in geothermal refugia during the global freezing were the founders of all subsequent complex life, and the genetic legacy of that founder effect may still be detectable in the deep divergences between the major lineages of eukaryotic life. The educational impact of the Snowball Earth hypothesis on the public understanding of deep time and planetary science has been considerable. Before the hypothesis was developed and communicated to a general audience, the Precambrian, the 4 billion years of Earth history before the Cambrian explosion, was largely invisible to popular science communication, overshadowed by the more dramatic and visually rich story of the Age of Dinosaurs. Snowball Earth gave the Precambrian a narrative, a story of global catastrophe, survival, and recovery that was as dramatic as anything that happened in the subsequent history of life. The hypothesis provided a way into the deep time of the Precambrian that had not previously been available, and it sparked a surge of popular interest in the Neoproterozoic that has brought new researchers into the field and new public attention to the period. The tidal forces that the moon exerts on the Earth affect the distribution of ocean water and the height of the tides, and those effects were different during the Neoproterozoic than they are today. 700 million years ago, the moon was closer to the Earth than it is now, because the moon is slowly moving away from the Earth at a rate of approximately 3.8 centimeters per year. Closer to the Earth, the moon exerted stronger tidal forces, producing higher tides and stronger tidal mixing of the ocean. That stronger tidal mixing may have affected the stratification of the Neo-Proterozoic ocean and the distribution of heat within it, influencing the dynamics of the Snowball Earth glaciation and deglaciation. The role of tidal dynamics in the Snowball Earth story is an aspect of the geophysics that has been relatively little studied, but that may be important for the accuracy of the climate models used to simulate those events. The volatility of the post-snowball climate is captured in the geological record of the Ediacaran period in a way that suggests the Earth was still finding its new equilibrium for tens of millions of years after the last glaciation ended. The carbon isotope record of the Ediacaran shows repeated large negative excursions, called Shurem-Winoka type excursions, that have been interpreted as evidence of repeated disruptions to the organic carbon cycle. Those disruptions may reflect the continued instability of the post-snowball ocean, with repeated episodes of anoxia and reoxygenation as the biological productivity of the recovering ocean interacted with the still unusual chemistry of the seawater. The Ediacaran was not merely the aftermath of Snowball Earth. It was an extended period of environmental instability during which the Earth's climate and ocean chemistry were slowly adjusting to the new state produced by the deglaciation. The mountain ranges that were present on Earth during the snowball glaciations would have protruded through the ice as nunataks, rocky islands in a sea of white, exposed to the full fury of the extreme snowball climate. Those nunataks, where the geothermal heat of the underlying rock prevented the formation of ice, may have been among the most important refugia for terrestrial life during the glaciation. Any photosynthetic organisms that had colonized the land surface in the Neo-Proterozoic, including cyanobacterial crusts and possibly early algal communities, might have survived the glaciation in the thin soils and rock surfaces of those exposed peaks. The biological legacy of those high-altitude refugia may include some of the lineages that would subsequently colonize the land more extensively once the ice melted, contributing to the evolution of terrestrial ecosystems that would eventually produce the first land plants in the Ordovician and Silurian periods. The long-term consequences of Snowball Earth for the structure of the Earth's mantle and crust are less well understood, but potentially significant. The weight of a global ice cover, distributed across the entire surface of the planet rather than concentrated at the poles as today's ice sheets are, would have exerted a different pattern of stress on the oceanic and continental crust than modern ice sheets do. The rebound of the crust as the ice melted, a process called isostatic rebound that is still occurring in regions that were glaciated during the last ice age, would have been global rather than regional, affecting tectonic processes in ways that are difficult to model. Some researchers have suggested that the deglaciation may have triggered a pulse of increased volcanic activity by releasing the pressure on the mantle, and that increased volcanic activity may have contributed to the high carbon dioxide levels of the post-snowball hothouse. The way the Snowball Earth story has been communicated to the public reflects the challenges of making deep time comprehensible. The events are so remote in time and so extreme in their parameters that they resist the kind of intuitive comprehension that comes from personal experience or from the analogy with historical events. No human being has ever experienced a global glaciation. No human civilization has ever witnessed the kind of climate transition that occurred at the end of Snowball Earth. The communication of those events requires the construction of analogies and metaphors that capture the essential character of the events without distorting their true nature, a challenge that scientists, science writers, and science filmmakers have approached with varying degrees of success. The most effective communications are those that connect the deep time events to the present in concrete ways, showing how the Neo-Proterozoic shaped the world we inhabit and how the organisms that survived the frozen Earth are our direct ancestors. The Snowball Earth hypothesis has also prompted a reassessment of the early history of multicellular life. For most of the 20th century, the prevailing view was that complex multicellular life appeared suddenly at the base of the Cambrian, in what appeared to be an explosion of diversity with no clear precursors. The careful study of the Ediacaran and Cryogenian periods, stimulated in part by the Snowball Earth research program, has revealed that the evolution of multicellularity and of complex body organization was a much more gradual process, beginning hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian and proceeding through a series of stages during which the key innovations of animal biology were developed and refined. The Cambrian explosion was real, but it was the culmination of a process that had been underway since the Neo-Proterozoic, and that process was shaped in fundamental ways by the selection pressures of the Snowball Earth events. The night sky during Snowball Earth would have displayed one feature that is absent from modern skies, a nearly complete absence of the atmospheric water vapor that today scatters light and limits the visibility of stars near the horizon. The dry, cold atmosphere of the frozen Earth would have been almost completely transparent, and from the surface of the ice, the stars would have been visible down to the horizon on every clear night, from every location on the planet. The Milky Way would have blazed across a sky of extraordinary clarity. The aurora borealis and aurora australis, driven by the same solar wind that produces them today, would have been visible not just from high latitudes, but potentially from much lower latitudes, because the frozen ocean extending to the equator would have changed the electrical properties of the atmosphere in ways that could have extended the auroral zones toward lower latitudes. It is an eerie and beautiful sky to imagine, blazing above a world of ice and wind and silence. The Snowball Earth Research Program is also a testament to the power of geological fieldwork in remote and difficult terrain. The sequences that provide the most complete records of the glaciation are often exposed in desert canyons, in Arctic outcrops, or in mountain ranges accessible only on foot over several days of hiking. The researchers who collected the samples that provided the foundation for the Snowball Earth hypothesis did so under conditions that combined the intellectual excitement of scientific discovery with the physical demands of working in some of the most challenging field environments on Earth. That combination of intellectual and physical challenge is one of the aspects of geology that attracts a particular type of scientist, and the Snowball Earth Research Program has been characterized throughout its history by the enthusiasm of those scientists for getting into the field and reading the rocks directly. The question of whether Snowball Earth could happen again is one that scientists answer with cautious reassurance rather than confident denial. The conditions that produced the Neo-Proterozoic glaciations, a continental configuration concentrated at low latitudes, a biological carbon cycle drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide, and a solar luminosity slightly lower than today, are not present in the modern world. The sun is brighter today than it was 700 million years ago, by approximately 6%. The continents are distributed at higher latitudes than they were during the Neo-Proterozoic, and the current concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide is far higher than the level that would approach the snowball threshold. For all those reasons, the climate is far from the snowball threshold today. But the existence of that threshold in the climate system is a permanent feature of a planet with an ice albedo feedback, and the conditions that approach it could, in principle, arise again over geological timescales. The Earth froze completely for millions of years, and life, stubborn and microscopic and impossible to fully eliminate, held on in the dark and the cold, near the warmth of volcanic vents, under thin ice where a fragment of light still reached. And from that impossibly narrow survival, everything followed. Every animal that has ever lived, every ecosystem that has ever existed, every thought that has ever been thought. All of it descended from organisms that refused to be extinguished by the longest winter the planet has ever known. That is worth sitting with for a moment before sleep. That is worth carrying into the dark. The Snowball Earth hypothesis is ultimately a story about what it means to be resilient. Not the resilience of strength or complexity or intelligence, but the resilience of simplicity, of flexibility, of the refusal to require conditions that are not available. The organisms that survived the frozen Earth had that kind of resilience. They could live on almost nothing, in almost any conditions, because they had no choice. And from that minimal survival, given enough time, The full complexity of the living world was reconstructed. That is the lesson of Snowball Earth. That what survives is not necessarily what is strongest, but what is most adaptable. And that lesson, however old, remains relevant. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. A new world to explore every week, always in the dark, always deeper than you expect. The story of how the Snowball Earth hypothesis moved from a fringe idea to scientific consensus over the course of 30 years is itself a case study in how science works. The initial proposals by Harland and Kirschvink were met with skepticism not because the evidence was weak, but because the conclusion was so extreme that it seemed to require extraordinary proof. The accumulation of evidence from multiple independent lines of investigation, each supporting the same conclusion, eventually reached the point where the alternative hypotheses became less parsimonious than the snowball hypothesis itself. That is how most major revisions in scientific understanding work, not through a single dramatic discovery but through the gradual accumulation of consistent evidence from multiple directions. The Snowball Earth story is a reminder that the most important scientific ideas are often the ones that seem most implausible when first proposed.